would you speak a little bit about how culturally, I mean, there were people who cared about animals, but really just to have them as possessions, or to get paid for them, and how there was a cultural transition to caring about animals when they were alive. This realization that, animals are bigger than just artifacts in a display. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that evolution was, if we can call it an evolution, was really interesting to me. I mean, and as you say, the conservation movement, the modern conservation movement really was started primarily by sportsmen who, I think had a genuine admiration for these animals. They thought they were beautiful. They loved the experience of hunting them. They respected them in the way that, a sportsman respects, a good sportsman respects the animals that he or she hunts. Um, but there was a sense that these animals were instruments of their hobby, that they weren't being protected for other reasons. The science of ecology was really young at the time. People didn't have a sense of, oh, these animals are part of an ecosystem and we're trying to protect the ecosystem. They were protecting iconic, beautiful species because they appreciated them for various reasons. And then birds were really interesting in a similar way. They were threatened for a number of reasons, but one of the, as you say, one of the threats to them was actually people who really loved them and wanted to get a close look at birds. And many naturalists and scientists didn't think much of going out and shooting a dozen species just because they wanted to study them very closely. And what really stopped that was not so much a change in attitude, but the invention of cheap optics. So once binoculars became affordable, and in fact, some prominent conservationists who were women wrote some great guides to seeing birds through your opera glasses, as they were called at the time, people generally stopped shooting them and started to appreciate them from a distance safely.
yeah. I mean, you talk about ecology too. So many of the national parks were set aside for scenic values. There wasn't thought given to habitat to preserve minimum viable populations of wildlife, and so when the conservation movement was coming about, there needed to be a learning curve, and I think that I don't want to jump too far ahead because there's so much to talk about before we get to some of these things. But one of the things I think is really imperative for the conservation movement, and you talk about how that has happened along the way, is for conservationists to self-reflect, to say, as Hornaday did, going out and shooting the last bison, probably, I mean, he evolved, again, but he didn't evolve in terms of the way he saw, I mean, the different races. I mean, at different times in the concert, or rather, just in terms of the way history unfolds, there are times that we, as a culture, need to self-reflect, and conservation has done it with Aldo Leopold and the wolf. And I'm setting up because I want you to talk about, like, when have conservationists had to look in the mirror and say, you know, killing a wolf is killing a sentient being. Talking about protecting land and talking about it being unpeopled is really a myth. And I also thought maybe you could talk about that recent essay you did on John Muir. So that's going to give you about an 4 hours.
I'll be here for the rest of the week, but don't mind me. But I mean, I don't want to oversimplify things by saying, oh, there's been this, moral progress, because it's of course not. It's not a linear progress. It's not a linear process. It's ongoing, and it doesn't move in one direction. That's for sure. But I think there has been, a general arc of increasing understanding in the conservation movement, where it's moved from saving iconic species for pretty instrumental reasons. We like them, or we eat them, or we eat them for fun. I'm not talking about subsistence hunters, but to yes, we protect all species because we think they're important for in some way. To we protect all species and we protect their habitats. And I think that circle of concern, so to speak, has gradually expanded over the course of the conservation movement. And perhaps the most recent and most belated expansion of that is, as you say, remembering that the places that the landscapes that conservationists have long wanted to respect also have a human history, and that human history has been often erased by conservationists themselves. And you talked about the piece I wrote for The Atlantic recently about John Muir, which was stepped off from my book a little bit, where I talked about a lot of people are critical of John Muir because of the racist language he used in some of his writings. John Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club, I should say. And my critique was, certainly I acknowledge that, but I think maybe the deeper problem for the conservation movement was John Muir's view of Yosemite and other places that he really loved as these blank slates where people had not existed before or did not have an existing claim, when in fact, of course, these places have a very long human history. And he almost saw the presence of humans, even people who had lived there for hundreds of years, as a polluting influence on Yosemite and other places that he protected. So my essay was about the fact that while John Muir and the Sierra Club certainly have made incredible contributions to conservation, the Sierra Club is now going through a reckoning with John Muir's legacy and looking at how his attitude toward these landscapes has influenced conservation over the last 100 years, and been critical of that, his what you might call a failure of imagination, his inability to see that these places had human histories as well as ecological histories, and then looking at how the Sierra Club's strategy going forward might start to encompass those human histories while not backing down on, I mean, I think that those two things they're always set up in conflict. I don't think it's necessarily that we have to choose between, are we protecting a peopled landscape versus are we protecting a wilderness area? I think that I think the conservation movement still has a long way to go in terms of recognizing all the opportunities there are for people to live sustainably within ecosystems, that it's not an either or proposition. Is it wilderness or is it lost to us forever? There are ways to protect these landscapes that either were or continue to be peopled, and to protect their ecosystems as well.
Well, and you are getting to my next question, which you do an incredible job of taking the history of American conservation thinking, and you sort of talk about, again, these various characters coming to terms with ethics. I mean, I think Leopold definitely is the father of environmental ethics. I think that in terms of animals have a right to be, that it's not just animals being there for human use, and he's fascinating, and again, he had been a hunter, but you are able to seamlessly weave all this into, ending the book, or the second to last chapter before you have your epilogue. We end up in Namibia, and which you do
quite a shock.
It's so deft. And so here we are, and we end up with a culture that's a herding culture that use the same landscape as wildlife. There are tourists who are bringing in revenue, potentially, but these herder communities depend on their livestock, and you talk about the pressures from drought, but you also talk about culturally. And I lived in Kenya for a year, and it was the same with tribes there, that livestock was actually an extension of identity, that this is who they are. And so you really make the point that if we are going to be successful in our in conservation in globally, we do need to recognize that these landscapes are being utilized and that they are necessary for people's livelihoods.
Yeah, and I mean, we talked about the beginnings of the conservation movement among sportsmen, mostly elite sportsmen in North America and Europe, and I would argue that sport hunters are still very important to conservation. But one thing that the conservation has not been very good at is including subsistence hunters and subsistence herders in the movement. In terms of supporting people who actually depend on and live alongside these species very directly, and they depend on them in very direct ways, supporting them in conserving these species, in reducing the short-term costs of protecting them for the long term, and helping them share in the benefits of protecting them. So there's a sort of a historical oversight there. And then there's also the separation uh, between people and wildlife that occurred during colonialization in Africa, because people when colonization happened, a lot of the first national parks and reserves followed colonial paths, and many people in Africa came to think of wildlife as something that got protected for wealthy foreigners, and not so much for subsistence hunters. And so the effort in Namibia, which is one of many around the world now that's been quite successful, it's a approach called community-led conservation, attempts to return some of that former management authority and responsibility to the local level, so that those decisions are being made. They exist within a structure, a hierarchy of authority that goes, from the local level to the state level to the regional level to the state level to the even the global level, so that species that are globally rare can be protected, but species can also be protected at a very local level in a very direct way that reawakens that connection that in some ways has been dormant for many, many years.
And so this got me thinking about
Mhm.
the success of, if you could talk a little bit about collaborative management, because I think that in reading your work, I see there's tremendous opportunity for these kind of relationships. And you talk about this man, Owen Smith,
Mhm.
Gary Owen Smith, is that his name?
Garth, yeah.
Garth
Mhm.
Owen Smith, who was able to establish relationships. I mean, it really is a matter of building relationships, and also looking at cultural relationships between wildlife and communities, human communities. And so and what I want to get to is
Mhm.
what is necessary to create a successful collaborative effort. And then to talk a little bit about that in American public land conflict. So
Right.
I'm getting us to some of these sticky issues, but I want to do it because I want to compare and contrast this sort of these case scenarios. What ensures success.
Yeah, and I have thought a lot about your work as I've learned more and more about community-led and community-based conservation, which, as I said, got its start in Africa, is now being practiced all around the world, and was really a reaction to this kind of top-down parks and reserve strategies created by national governments, often by colonial governments, that had some short-term benefits in terms of protecting species from extinction, but in the long term really disrupted the existing relationships, the existing management structures that had been in place before colonization. And I think you mentioned Garth Owen Smith, and he was a white South African who moved to Namibia in the late 60s, just fell in love with the people and the landscape, and just, was willing to do just about any kind of job in order to stay. And so he started out his relationships with the people and the communities of northern Namibia with a real shared, genuine love of the landscape, and I think importantly, a commitment to it. He was going to be there. And as people got to know him, they realized, oh, this guy's not going anywhere. He's gonna figure out how to stay. And he spent, unlike many people in the international conservation movement, who I think are somewhat like public land employees in the US, they have a post in overseas and they stay there for a few years and they try to move the needle on some policy and then they might move somewhere else. Garth Owen Smith knew he was going to be working with these communities for the rest of his life, which he did. He passed away last year. And so he was really thinking long term. He was willing and very able to invest in, individual relationships with communities. And he was also very good at taking the back seat, I think is one way to describe it. He really just expressed interest in helping people support themselves and helping them have more animals around, which I think that it was important that there was beneath the occasional resentment that existed between people and wildlife, or by people toward wildlife that happened to be troublesome, there was an underlying shared commitment to protect species for the long term. People really, they might get angry about government policy, but they didn't want those species to go extinct. And they were happy when Garth Owen Smith showed up and started brainstorming with them about ways that they could both gain some more power for themselves, but also improve their livelihoods and improve the lot of wildlife that they knew well.
And so we have some differences in culture and
just a few, yes.
And the rural West. And I'm in Idaho right now. I'm not in Bozeman, where I usually live. And there's a bill on Governor Little's desk right now to sign into law that would allow the wolf population in Idaho, which I think is over 1,000, to get down to 150. And so you have a culture, and it's not just the Bundys, which is the family that I worked on that was involved with the Malheur Wildlife Refuge takeover, as well as the standoff in Nevada over grazing issues. But we have a culture in the West that doesn't value certain types of wildlife, and you talk about this in your book. I mean, I think hunters, I mean, in any case, actually, it was more sort of the ranching interests that wanted to have all the wolves decimated. They were okay with the deer, and we know what happened on the Kaibab, that because there was such an explosive deer population, there was a mass starvation event that happened when Aldo Leopold was still alive. I think that was in the
20s, I think. Yeah.
But because we understand ecology, we understand the need for predators, but we have a culture in the West that has specific ideas about predators. And even before we get into the Bundys, I think it's interesting to sort of talk about how, even though predation of livestock it's not a big issue. I mean, and I was talking to some activists here this morning, and so I'm not going to have the exact numbers, but there are not that many cows and sheep that get killed every year by wolves in Idaho, and yet it is the biggest issue in terms of let's extirpate wolves. And you talk about it with we've never seen a case of brucellosis go from the bison to a cow, and yet we kill so many bison a year to prevent brucellosis transmission. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, like those kind of cultural, I mean, they're not even really they're sensational, to
Hmm.
a certain extent.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a piece of it that is, that I think is just good old human fear and resentment. And I saw some of that in Namibia as well, and heard about it over time. You know, people just uh, became outraged that elephants were trampling their crops, and in many ways understandably so. This was a huge economic impact, and even worse, sometimes there were safety concerns with, you know, and people did get hurt and sometimes killed by, you know, individual wayward animals. um, but there's an overlay, I think, in the West. And I saw this also in Norway, where I did a story a couple of years ago about wolf recovery there. There's an overlay, I think, driven in large part by the internet, of uh, misinformation or disinformation, and just escalation of outrage, you know, that happens where, you know, there's a kernel, as in many issues we see today, there's a kernel of legitimate concern. And I think that legitimate concern is, it's not easy to allay, but it can be addressed through measures like community-based conservation, where the costs and benefits are shared more equitably and are balanced out, so that people can advance conservation on a local level. What's much harder to address through community-based conservation is this uh, disjunct reality, you know, where people are dealing with two different sets of facts. Um, and I think, you know, we see that in conservation and in, you know, an infinite number of other issues in the US today. One thing I will, one small note of hope that I learned about in Norway was that, and there they have had wolves return on their own from other parts of Europe. They were pretty much shot to extinction in Norway in the early part of the 1900s, and then in the 70s and 80s they started returning on their own, and now there's a quite healthy and still growing population of wolves in Norway. And it's a very similar dynamic to what you see in the American West. A lot of whipped up fear, demonstrations against wolves, demonstrations for wolves, you know, outraged social media conversations, all that sort of thing. But a biologist I spoke to said that one of his most successful initiatives was a something of a citizen science project, where he got people in a rural area to advise him, and this was on another somewhat controversial predator, the lynx. He got them involved in survey work for lynx numbers, and said, okay, you tell me where to put you know the landscape, you tell me where to put the cameras, you go out and collect the data, you know, you go out and collect the you know, cards that have our photos on them from the camera traps and so forth. And that just basic participation in the data collection, I think he felt, and the people I talked to who had participated in it felt like that showed respect for their knowledge of the landscape, but it also gave them trust in the data because they had participated in their collection, in its collection. So it didn't solve the problems, of course, but it was a step toward a shared reality, which is, I think, what we're struggling with now in North America.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I like that you brought that up, because I think there is something really sort of engaging about citizen scientist initiatives. I worked, I mean, this was years back. I ran an organization and we worked with Buddhist monks on snow leopard conservation,
Oh,
and
yeah.
set up citizen scientists kits for some of the young monks, so that they, you know, because they were in some of the most remote places in Mongolia, and that, excuse me, in Bhutan. But it was an idea that had you know, so I had brainstormed with George Schaller, who has also done some really interesting stuff with citizen scientist initiatives in Tibet, and also some of these religious layers, where he talks about you know, Milarepa, the Buddhist saint, having turning into a snow leopard, and gets local people engaged in kind of a religious appreciation for wildlife, which I think has been really interesting. And so I'm going to move to the Bundys because I'm going to talk about religion a little bit.
Yeah, I was going to ask you.
And how there's religion that works, and then there's religion that doesn't work in terms of moving towards conservation. So, but the things that I was thinking about, Michelle, in terms of citizen scientist initiatives that prevent success in the West, is that there are people who just don't value wildlife. I mean, they just, that, whether it's a wolf or whether it's, a sage grouse or whatnot, that there's no consideration there, that they don't believe in science. They just, and what you're talking about is really interesting in terms of having local people engage in data collection, and therefore, they do believe in it because they're collecting it. Let's see, a distrust, of course, of the government, which, that's the Bundys are famous for that. And then also certain ideas that personal liberties are way more important than protecting public lands or even obeying the law. And that has contributed to these conflicts, and may very well, and most likely will be occurring again, as the Biden administration and Deb Haaland, Secretary of Interior, has to face some very, very tense, potentially tense issues that will arise in conservation over American public lands. So I guess I want to talk to you about, we talked about this a little bit in advance because I wanted to have a chance to talk to you. But in terms of how we move forward, let's brainstorm a little bit about,
Yeah,
because we do have this issue, and I do think there's merit in citizen science. I do think there's merit in, as you said, having people invest in relationships like your friend Garth, long-term relationship building. I do think, as we talked about a little bit yesterday before this, that there was a collaborative effort in Malheur that may very well have protected that area from further disruption over the Bundy takeover in 2016. So I'm wondering, if we were sitting in front of Deb Haaland right now, what could we be talking to her about in terms of successful conservation models?
Yeah, great question. I think your example of the Malheur Collaborative is really good. Collaborative efforts don't have to include everyone. They don't have to include the extremes, because I think, and I have actually reported on collaborative efforts a long time, ever since I was at High Country News in the 90s, and often, I saw plenty of collaborative efforts get shot down by people on the left. And I can imagine if you got the Bundys in a room to talk about collaborative conservation, they would, shoot it down from the extreme right pretty quickly. So I think that the aspiration doesn't need to be, we got to get everyone at the same table, because, not only will it be unsuccessful, but you're going to end up, the whatever you might agree on is not going to be that meaningful in terms of conservation. But the Malheur Collaborative, it sounds like, did function as something of a buffer against the intrusion of the Bundys in that community and into that landscape, and people who might have been otherwise been sympathetic to their rhetoric had learned through experience and over time and through relationships that, oh, okay, these guys from the government are not as evil as they're sometimes painted to be. They actually have some good ideas. We all depend on this landscape. Maybe it's not so bad to get together and work out ways that we can cooperatively protect it. And I think that's worth doing, if nothing else, than to push back against this. I think it's if it's, I think it's a strain in some religions. I think it's a strain in American culture, this worship of the individual, and this assumption that we're here, everything else on earth is here to serve us. I think collaborative efforts can, again, they may not include everyone, but they can push back against the strength of that narrative, and they can provide another one.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. I think that, one of the things that was really important about the collaborative efforts in and around the Malheur Wildlife Refuge is that they included the Burns tribe, the Northern
Yes.
Paiute, who,
Yep.
I mean, that's their homeland. And
Yep.
that was a big piece of it. I mean, when the Bundys took over Malheur, they talked about, we need to get this back to the loggers, the miners, and the ranchers.
I
And
know. I remember seeing a press conference where there was a tribal leader who was just like, you have got to be kidding me.
exactly. I mean, the fact uh, the fact that some people in the West forget that history was happening before white settlement, and
Right.
and that these landscapes are indigenous landscapes. And I think that Bears Ears is a great example of, again, a very collaborative effort. And there's ranching that's going on there. I mean, there's grazing that's going on there. But again, it really includes a number of different partners to be involved. With the Bundys, there's no interest at all in collaboration. And it's, and they've convinced themselves that they're right. And I think that you mentioned a little bit this idea of individual liberties versus common good, and common good includes wildlife protection.
Yeah.
And we just have, I mean, we're not going to be able to engage everybody in it, just like you said. And the other piece is there has to be consequences for people who take over wildlife refuges,
Yeah.
um,
Or the US Capitol.
uh,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think that type of anti-government, lawless anger contributed to the insurrection on January 6th, and it's an extension. And I just, when we look about, or excuse me, when we look at how we're going to go about protecting public land now, I just it's something that keeps me up at night, because I do think that we're going to have another standoff. I think that that's something that the Bundys have been involved in campaigning along those lines. And I think about and I want to go back to some of the nice stuff you talked about, because I don't want to end this
That's
on
okay.
but I don't want to end this on a sort of, oh no, we have so many insurmountable problems, because I actually think we have a lot of really a lot of good that's happening now. And I love, and we're never going to have the Bundys be on board, and that's something that we're going to have to deal with. And it's something that I think Merrick Garland is taking very seriously, and that these sort of radical groups are being addressed. I mean, for example, Stuart Rhodes was in Washington, D.C. He's the head of the Oath Keepers. He and Ammon are tightly connected. He was at Battle of Bunkerville, but I'll tell you, Merrick Garland and the FBI right now really are paying attention to Stuart Rhodes. So I do think that there are people, I mean, these groups have been left unwatched, particularly under the Trump administration.
Mhm.
And so you do have that. And I hope that that's being monitored, and I hope that they will be brought to justice. But then you also have this wonderful vision from E.O. Wilson, as inspired by, oh my
Tony
gosh,
Hiss.
yes, in the 30 by 30
Mhm.
vision, and this wonderful these things that are big, large landscape initiatives that people are working on. And so the Bundys might be a fly in the ointment, but there's plenty of things to be hopeful about. And I was going to say Michael Soule. I mean, this wonderful idea of conservation biology, and the fact that we still do have public lands and many contiguous pieces. And there's this idea of corridors, and we know what we need. And you say in your book, it may take 100 years or a few centuries, but there are things to look forward to.
Yeah, I think there are. And I mean, I think the Bundys are part of a right-wing extremism problem that we have in the US. It is especially bad now. We've had it for a long time. And it's a law enforcement problem. It's an intelligence problem. And it happens to be, or an intelligence challenge, and it happens to be playing out on the stage of the public lands. And it's affected, of course, by public lands issues, but it's really not a land management problem. It's intertwined with that. I don't mean to imply it's separate, but there's a law enforcement problem that I think we can't set aside, but we can think of as being we can think of lawful land management in 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 some senses as apart from that. I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't think we have to arrange our whole view of public lands management around the nefarious influence of the Bundys, right? Because there's another arm of the government that is and should be dealing with their violations of the law.
Yeah.
And so I do see some hopeful things that I think and hope can take place even in spite of that continuing, threat of extremism. And probably the most prominent one is one you mentioned, which is the increasing involvement and leadership of tribes and First Nations in management of tribal lands and management of tribal lands in ecological connection with public lands. I think the work that some of the tribes in Montana, as well as some of the tribes in Canada, are doing with bison and reconnecting the bison to its former habitat on the plains is some of the most exciting stuff that's happening in conservation right now, because they're working with a population that's not desperately endangered. It's pretty healthy. They're trying to take it to the next level to really make it, really help it recover its place in the ecosystem. And they're doing it for not only, directly practical reasons, but cultural reasons, spiritual reasons, ecological reasons. The whole package is there. And it's a very inclusive, very, I think, really powerful effort that could have an influence on people's daily lives throughout the Great Plains. And I think that's just thrilling to see. And we're seeing a lot of other efforts by Indigenous people, both in North America and worldwide, to reclaim their stewardship of traditional lands. And we know from history and experience that with support, some of these traditional methods of management are some of the best ways we know of to protect these ecosystems. And so I think there's a real opportunity both in North America and elsewhere to expand our definition of conservation, and that's in no way to imply that we should water down our goals or anything. It's just to say, let's expand our definition of conservation beyond parks and reserves and into landscapes that people can live within in sustainable ways, and in something approaching harmony with other species, because we know it's possible. We just have to provide the opportunity in whatever way that's needed.
And there's a question that's come up, but I just wanted to add to that. I have a friend who is Shoshone, and she's involved now in organizing bison hunts. And the idea that there's this return to traditional bison hunts, I think is incredibly important. And again, a form of hunting, but a sustainable hunting. It's traditional, and utilizing the landscape, but also there is this sacred significance to the bison that I think is it's really neat to hear that these are things that are beginning to happen. And again, I think go back into some of the models that you have talked about. And I mean, you spend time, and I can't remember, was it the Blackfeet? Did you spend time? Okay, so talking about bison and the traditional role of bison in that culture as well. So okay, here's Carmen. What can be done to steer the US more into a for the common good mode as opposed to individual rights? Oh,
Yeah, right. That'd be good, huh?
uh, yeah. What you go first?
Well, I'm not going to solve perhaps the hardest problem facing our species in the next 2 minutes, but I will tell you that if there is one thing I hope people will remember from my book, if I had to pick one thing, it would be that the very famous metaphor of the tragedy of the commons is not inevitable. That's a very sticky metaphor that was coined in the 1960s. And its implication is that, you know, given the chance, uh, everyone's going to act like an individualistic American and take all the resources that they need, and until a shared resource is totally depleted. And certainly that happens. We see it around us all the time, but we know from years and years of research now that it's not as inevitable as the person who coined the phrase made it out to be. Like there are systems that have been in place for hundreds of years where people share resources, and there are many ways, modern and traditional, of sharing resources without resorting to, you know, authoritarian means or radical privatization or anything like that. So I would just, I certainly don't have the answer to, you know, counteracting that really radical go it alone mentality in American culture, except to say that there are alternatives. And I think the more we can get them out there, the more the movement can get them out there, the better. I mean, there's people, when I talk about this kind of thing with conservationists, there's a real instinctive pushback, like, no, no, no. Humans really, I mean, not among everyone, of course, but there's this almost this counterintuitive reaction where people are like, no, but it is true. It is, we are really bad. We are going to use up all our resources. And it's like, no, 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 yes, we are certainly capable of that, but there are other possibilities. And I think we can keep believing in those other possibilities while still being alert to the very real threats, whether the threats are extremism or just our sort of heedless consumption.
Yeah, I think I mean, I would say, just as you're saying, I mean, one of the things that is American is this idea of liberty, and the way that it's been interpreted, especially during pandemic, by some people has been very alarming. And the fact that there's been emphasis on individual liberties versus common good. And but there also have been so many people who have really adhered to protecting the common good. I mean, I think it's really important in looking at where we are right now. And your point about public lands being one manifestation of a variety of different issues. I mean, it's Second Amendment rights, and it's wearing a mask or not getting vaccinated, or, you know, I can put as many AUMs or animal unit monthlies on public lands as I want to. It's my liberty. And so, but that is a small population. I think most people really do when they understand public lands. And again, that's another issue. I don't think people who don't live in the West understand public lands, but do love them. But I also think most people also care about the common good when they understand, you know, that wearing a mask helps other people. And yeah, it is something that you mentioned it too, that this idea of rugged individualism, this idea of, you know, this American notion of liberty, it's with us, it's baked into the bones of this country. So it's just that, how do you get the people who are going to be able to be collaborative and who do care about the common good in the room together, and then move forward to the best of one's ability. Okay, Carol, are you planning on expanding your work and influence in stopping the tragedy of commons? If so, will you share how?
I would love to. I'm not sure how, other than to keep writing about it, as I certainly hope to do. I think Namibia was personally a very eye-opening experience for me, because while I'd read about these efforts for a long time and attended, been observed and been involved with some somewhat parallel efforts in North America, I'd never witnessed a community-led conservation effort in action, and seeing it happen in all of its sometimes chaotic glory was quite memorable for me, and I felt really inspired to find, well, I don't need to find them, I don't need to discover them, they've already been discovered, but to report on the many other similar efforts that are going on around the world, and bring them to hopefully wider attention, because I do feel, as I said, I do feel that we need a sense of conservation movement and the climate movement relies so much on alarm to motivate its supporters. I think we need a corresponding sense of opportunity. And as journalists, I feel that we are very good at alarm and not so good at opportunity as well. And so I'm looking for ways as a writer and as a journalist to do more of that.
So that brings us to about an hour, and I don't have any questions. I don't know if Kit wants to pop back in, but I just want to say what a fabulous. I just love talking to Michelle. I mean, I feel like I could talk and talk and talk and talk to you. We have a lot of things that we're passionate about, and that we share. And I also want to thank the Bozeman Public Library and the Country Bookshelf, who, just, oh my gosh, we're so lucky in Bozeman to have these organizations, and it's Give Big. So make a donation to the public library audience. And also thank you, all of you who participated. I so appreciate it. And Michelle, I'm sure you have a few ending comments as well.
Well, thanks so much, Betsy. And I hope that those of you, if you're tuning in from Bozeman or elsewhere, I hope you already know about Betsy's book. But if you don't, American Zion, it's really, let me get it in the screen. How do I do that? Yeah.
There you go.
It's really a decoder ring for the West in many ways, especially for our present moment. So I highly recommend it. And it actually, there is so much overlap between the things that we're thinking about, even though they're in some ways very different on the surface. So I just have loved this conversation, and I hope it continues. And thanks to Kit and the library for hosting us. Thanks to all of you for coming out on a beautiful evening too.
I know, thank you. You can see the sun is hitting me now.
Oh yeah.
And
and I also want to say bye, beloved beasts, because it's amazing. It is so good.
Thank you.
Or you could do like I did and get the Audible, the book, and I have it on Kindle, which I have already shared with these.
Well, I just want to say I've never really been a successful matchmaker, but I feel like it's happened with you too. So and thank you so much for sharing this amazing wealth of knowledge for both of you. It's been a really intriguing night. So thank you. I did record most of it. I missed the first thing because I'm always forgetting these things. But anyway, it will be on YouTube, and KGVM, I believe, is recording it too. So it will be on their website as well as an audio recording. So thank you guys, and have a great rest of the day. And I hope to see you again, Michelle. Maybe we can get you to Bozeman.
Yes.
I love that. Yeah.
Yes, let's do that.
Okay.
Totally love it. All right. Good night, everyone. Enjoy that high latitude sun, and
Yeah.
Talk to you soon. Take
All
care.
Right.
Thanks again.
Yeah. Bye.
That was good. It was fun. And I'll see you soon, hopefully in Bozeman.
Yeah, we've got some really good comments. So
Yeah, it was great. What
okay.
a fun event. Thanks for organizing
Oh
it.
my gosh, Betsy, thank you. Bye.
Take care.
Oh, good luck.